So thanks very much for joining us today, and we're really excited to have Jones Day once again partner with us, and thanks Mark and to the firm for all your support, both hosting as well as volunteering on Election Day. So if you could take a look at your materials, I just want to make sure everybody gets a sense of what you have here in front of you. So I'm going to go in order. On top, what you have is a credential. It's a little card here. This is something that you carry around. And if anybody asks you any questions as to why you're in the polling place, like the owner of the building or the janitor at the school and just wants to make sure you're official, just show them that, and it explains sort of what you're going to be doing there. You also have a parking pass, and this is to allow you to park without having to feed the meters. If you drive on Election Day, it's only good for Election Day, so don't keep it afterwards. And also we want to make sure you don't park in the accessible parking, because that would sort of be very badly ironic if you did that. So don't do that. The next document you have is another credential. This is different than the first credential. The card is something you carry around for the people who own the building. The credential is something you have to give to the polling place judge, the election judge, every time you go into a polling place, because as a matter of law, you're not allowed to go into a polling place that isn't your own unless you have a credential. All right. So what we're going to want you to do with these is to make copies of all the number of polling places you're going to be going to, and then fill them out when you go in. And before you even start doing your surveying, hand it into any election judge at that precinct. And they're used to seeing these kind of things. But this also explains what we're doing, and it just is good to get that as you start your review. So make copies of, and you'll find out later how many you're going to be doing based on how many hours you agree to volunteer, and then turn it in. And if you're in pairs, you each need to turn in a credential. Okay, it's only good per person, so make sure you do that. The next document you'll see is an Election Day volunteer sign-up form. And so hopefully most of you will be able to volunteer on Election Day. What we need you to do is, before you leave today, fill this out and leave it just on the table before you leave, so that we know and we can get back in touch with you. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be emailing you links to all the different polling places that you're going to be going to. We're actually doing these on smartphones now, and so you'll just pull up the link when you're ready to go do your training and do your evaluation, and fill it in on your phone. So we need to be able to have your email address so we can send that to you. We need to know some other things, like, do you have a car or not? Are you interested in a 4-hour shift or an 8-hour shift? And again, the shift isn't really a matter of when you do it. It's more tells us how much time you're willing to commit, so we know how many polling places to give to you. So the polls open at 6 in the morning and they go until 7 at night. We don't care when you go, but just know that it takes usually about 45 minutes to an hour for each polling place. So we usually give people 4 to 6 polling places if they do a half day, and then up to maybe 10 to 12 for a full day, something like that. So maybe 8, depending on how many people sign up. So just fill that in, and then that'll let us know what you're interested in doing and how to get back in touch with you. So we need that before you leave. The next one is a waiver, just to make sure if there's any problems that Equip for Quality is still in business. So if you could sign that, we'd appreciate that. And then the final document is an evaluation form. For us to be able to continue to be a CLE provider, we need to have good not good evaluations, but show that we allow people to evaluate us and turn those in. So, and this training has been approved for professionalism credit. So it's not just run-the-mill CLE, it's professionalism credit, which is often hard to get. So you get 1.5 hours of that. It does take a while for them to approve it, so you'll probably get that sometime in November. After that, you'll see your PowerPoint, which is up here, a DOJ checklist. We're not going to really go through this today, but if you have any sort of questions after the training, it's a good sort of primer on how to do different measurements. And then the last document, sometimes people really like to see a survey as they're going along with this training. As I said, you're going to be having electronic versions of the survey on Election Day, but some people like to see it in paper, so that's why we've made a copy of that for you. So you can use that to follow along or to look at the survey afterwards. Any questions about the materials? If I got everything that I talked about? Great. Okay, so today what we're going to be doing is I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what Voting Access Chicago is, tell you a little bit about the laws that are applicable. This is CLE, so we have to make sure we talk about the law. And then most of the time we're going to be spending just explaining to you how you'll be reviewing and assessing polling place accessibility, conducting these surveys. So as Mark referenced, DOJ came into Illinois back in 2016 the March primary, and they worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they found about 80 to 90% of polling places had some sort of barrier for people with disabilities. And so they approached the Chicago Board of Elections and said, we want to work collaboratively with you, and if you're not willing to work collaboratively, we're going to go to court. And the Board of Elections said, we'll go with the collaborative route. And they aren't experts in accessibility, and so they contracted with the Court for Quality, so we've been working with them ever since. And really, under the agreement currently, the polling places should all be accessible by the presidential election in 2020. So only 2 years from now, we're hoping that's where we'll be. And starting this election, the Board of Elections is going to start putting in some remedies, because as Mark referenced, we've done this before, and we were learning where some of the barriers are. And so now the Board of Elections is going to be putting out some of these temporary remedies. And when you're going out, hopefully you'll see some of these remedies, and we'll talk about what those will be in a second. When we're talking about barriers to voting, there are a number of barriers. The first bullet point is really the barrier we're going to be focusing on as part of your pro bono work, and that's the inaccessible polling places and equipment, and we'll be talking a lot about that. But there are other barriers that people with disabilities face. They face discriminatory practices and attitudes from a variety of people, election officials, poll workers, guardians, caretakers. A lot of well-meaning people think, oh, well, you're a person with a disability, you shouldn't be able to vote if you have an intellectual disability, or those kinds of things. Some people think if you're under guardianship, you're not allowed to vote, and that's not the case in Illinois. There's also a lack of accessible transportation, and just a lack of knowledge of voting rights and really what your rights are when you're going to the polling place, including the rights. People with disabilities don't even sometimes know their own rights as far as what they're entitled to when they go to a polling place. Two main laws really apply here, two federal laws. The first one I'm sure you're familiar with, the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed back in 1990. And the ADA is divided up in various sections called titles, and Title II covers state and local government services. And that's where voting comes in, because it's a local government activity that's being done. And polling places have to really comply with all the ADA requirements that we see in other places, like the width of doors and things like that. They just have to comply on one day of the year. So it's kind of a unique situation. You're looking at a snapshot one day of the year. But these places like schools and a lot of the places that host polling places really should be accessible all year round too. And so we are working with other parts of the city to address some of these barriers so that they're not just accessible on election day, but also the rest of the year as well. The other law that applies here is a law you may not be as familiar with, the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002. It's the one that was passed after the 2000 election. People remember Bush v. Gore and the hanging chads, and there was just all up in arms about all the problems with voting systems. Well, when they tried to fix the voting systems, they also wanted to address disability, because there was testimony in Congress about these barriers that people with disabilities face. And so one of the things that they've added to polling places, which you've probably seen in the election since 2002, is that there is now an accessible voting machine in every single polling place. Primarily, this is for people who are blind, so that they can go in and vote independently and privately. And that's really what the Help America Vote Act is all about, is allowing people with disabilities to vote independently and privately. It's something we all take for granted, but think about it. If you were blind, you went into a polling place and you had to tell somebody who you wanted to vote for, and then trust them that they would write in the right answer. And so this is to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to vote independently and privately, and also that people can get into the polling place. Illinois has a law called curbside voting, which allows the voting judges to come out to you if you can't get in. And DOJ is aware of that law, but they said that law does not trump federal law, and so we want people to be able to have people come out if that's what their choice is, but if they want to go in, they should be able to go into a polling place just like anybody else. Again, the independent and private aspect of things that you don't get at curbside voting or by assistance by a judge. So let's talk about the survey. So you're going to be doing this electronic survey, like we said, on your phone, on your tablet. And it's designed in a way that hopefully is logical as to how a voter would be accessing the polling place. So it starts with, is there a parking area where a voter can park? If so, we need to make sure that's accessible. Is there what's called a passenger drop-off area, which is an area where voters can be dropped off out front? We'll talk about what that means. And then what about the route up to the front door? Is it accessible? Then the front door. Can the person get in? Are there any barriers there? Once the person goes into the building, is the path from the front door to the voting area, is that accessible? Then we get to the voting area. We want to make sure the voting area itself is accessible. And then there's three other things we're going to be looking at that will apply One is ramps. Are there any ramps on the way and making sure they're accessible? There's some special measurements for ramps. And then also, are there any lifts or elevators that people encounter when they're on the way to vote, and are those accessible? I also just want to say, if you have any questions along the way, please just feel free to interrupt me because we want to make sure we answer any questions that you have. So on this slide, and you'll see this on your handout, we're just giving you a few slides from the actual survey itself, just to give you a sense of what it looks like and what you're going to be doing. So some of the things are going to be pre-populated, like the precinct, the name of the building that the polling place is going to be in, that sort of thing. But then you're going to have to fill in some things. So the first thing that you're going to be asked to fill in is the designated entrance the same as the primary entrance? So election officials have a choice. They can either use the main entrance that the building has, or if that's not easily made accessible, they try to identify, is there another place that a person could enter the building that is accessible, that could be considered the designated alternative accessible entrance. Then you fill in sort of what the location is of the accessible entrance if different, because sometimes what happens is like a school will be a polling place, and for one election it'll be this door will be the accessible entrance, and then they'll change it to another door, and it gets really confusing. So we want you to be as specific as possible as to what the accessible entrance is so that we know exactly what you've been measuring. And we also want to know where it is that they're doing the election activity. Where are people voting? Because again, we see this especially in schools, that they move it around. And so one election will say, okay, this room is great, and then all of a sudden they'll be in a totally different location. We'll have to reassess it. So being as detailed as possible is very helpful for us there. All right, so as you're walking in, there's 4 things you're going to answer on this slide. One is there a parking lot or garage available for voters? So let's just take a second and make sure we're on the same page here. So the ADA does not worry at all, especially when it comes to voting, to on-street parking. So if there's on-street parking, that's not something that we want you to look at all. It's a sort of a bonus if there's accessible on-street parking, but that's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at are there any parking garages or parking lots that are part of the voting area, the building that's providing it. So a classic example is you have a library that's being a polling place, and they have a parking lot that's typically for people going to the library on election day. Voters can park in that parking lot. Well, if that's the case, if voters can park in that parking lot, it needs to be accessible to voters with disabilities who are driving to the polling place. If it's a private parking lot, say it's just for employees, like a school has it just for their teachers to park in that, and it's not for voters, we don't need you to check and to make sure there's accessible parking, because that's not something they're saying is available for voters. Sometimes it's not very clear, and you might have to ask if it is available for voters. And if you're not sure, it's always good to measure just in case, but we have a note section where you can fill that in just in case there is any kind of confusion. And remember, we're talking about the lot that is for that building. So if you're downtown and there happens to be a parking garage next door of a separate commercial facility, we're not interested in you measuring that. It's only when the building itself is providing that kind of parking. And it can be either a parking lot or a parking garage. Again, we want to know about the passenger drop-off area, which I'll explain to you what that is. The reason why these questions are important at the very beginning is because if you say no, there is no parking for voters, then you're not going to see any parking questions at all. So it triggers a set of questions. If there's not a passenger drop-off area, you won't see any of those questions at all. They want to make sure, the third one you'll answer yes really every time. Is there an exterior route to the designated entrance from public sidewalks? There's really no place I can think of in Chicago that doesn't have sidewalks that lead to these places. And then is there an exterior route from the accessible entrance from a public transportation stop? Okay. And what we're talking about there is we're talking about a public transportation stop that's right within that block. So we don't mean several blocks away. We're not asking you to measure beyond that block. So if it's within that block, or literally across the street from the block where the polling place is, that's what we're concerned about, nothing else. Okay, and then the other preliminary things you're going to answer as you're walking in, and remember you're walking in through the accessible entrance, the one they designate accessible, whether it's the main one or the one they've said, is do you encounter any ramps on the way to the polling area? All right, so if there's a ramp, but it's not one a person with disability would have to use to get to the polling area, it just happens to go to another part of the school, that's not relevant. It has to be on the way to the voting area. The same thing with lifts and with elevators. All right, you may go into a senior citizen building and it's an elevator building, right? But if the election is being held in the first floor and no voters have to go up that elevator to get to the area, we don't need you to measure that elevator. It's only if the elevator is part of the path of travel to the voting area. Does that make sense? And then you just put in the numbers, and then based on the number you put in, that's how many extra questions you'll get for those different issues, for a ramp, for a lift, and for an elevator. Okay, so when you get the survey is designed in a way that you're answering either yes, no, or not applicable. All right? And yes, the general rule is yes means good. That means it's generally accessible. So that's the desired outcome for the voting authorities. No means there's some sort of problem. And whenever you answer no, it's going to automatically give you some temporary and permanent remedies on how to fix it. So you're not going to see these remedies unless you answer no, and then your phone will just spit out some different options that you'd have, and then you could check any temporary and any permanent remedy that you think would fix this. They're pretty self-explanatory and intuitive. There is an other box, so if you guys come up with remedies that we haven't come up with ourselves, certainly you can write those in, but the ones we've given you hopefully are pretty much the ones that will cover the area that we'll have. And we'd like you to find at least one temporary and one permanent remedy, because in some situations, the Board of Elections is going to use temporary remedy just because of cost issues, and others they're going to make the decision to make a permanent remedy for all through the year. You're also, if you answer no, you're also going to be asked to take a picture of that. The Department of Justice wants to see what these barriers look like. And so that'll pop up just automatically on your smartphone. Just so you know, those will go only into our survey. They will not be on your camera roll, so you don't have to worry about us taking up too much space. But if you don't take the picture when it's prompted, you can't move on to the next question. So make sure you do that. It usually takes just a couple seconds for the phone to catch up to you, and then you take the picture and it moves on. You only have to take a picture if there is a barrier. So if you've answered no, if you answer yes or not applicable, you won't be asked to do that or to provide a remedy. Okay. And I think we covered all of these things. No, you have to do the temporary and permanent remedy. You're not limited to a single remedy. And then also, if you come up with something else, there'll be room for you to do that. Also, there is a way to go back and forth in the survey if you need to go back where you were, but make sure you hit that back arrow within the survey itself, okay? If you hit the back arrow in the browser, that'll take you out of the survey and you might lose some information. So make sure you just use the back arrow within the survey itself. Okay, so now we're going to get to the actual measurement thing. So you're going to be measuring a couple different things. So if you take out your black bag, and if you don't have a black bag yourself, if you could just look on with somebody who has a black bag. And there should be 4 things in your bag. You should have a, well, actually 5 things. There should be a pen in there and a clipboard, but we're not really going to worry about those. You should have a tape measure, an orange tape measure that looks like this. This should be pretty familiar. The one feature I wanted to point out in the tape measure is that there is a lock feature, and sometimes you're going to be measuring above you, and so that lock feature is really nice. Just press this black button, and it locks it so you can measure above yourself a little easier. You also should have, I'm sorry, do everybody have what they need? Okay, sorry. You also should have a door pressure gauge, all right, to measure doors, and we'll show you how to measure that. And then the other thing you'll have, and we're not going to use this quite yet, but just so you have it, is a digital level, okay? And we'll show you how to work that in just a second. One thing to remember is that you need to measure everything that's asked of you, even if it's compliant, okay? So we want measurements for compliant and non-compliant. It's only when it's non-compliant that you do the pictures and the remedies, but you do a measurement for everything that is applicable. Okay, let's just go over a few survey terms before we get to the actual survey itself. One of the big ones that you'll have if you do have an area that has parking, remember a parking lot or a parking garage, not on-street parking, is a van accessible parking space. So the ADA requires every voting area to have at least one van accessible parking space. The reason why it's called a van accessible parking space is it has this access aisle so that if a van pulls out and somebody comes out, there's room there. They're not adjacent right to a car. So you'll see that every van accessible parking space will have this access aisle. It's usually striped to designate what it is, and we'll talk about what the measurement needs to be. And then if it's covered, there needs to be enough height for a van to be able to get in. And we'll talk about measuring parking garages in a second. And then there needs to be additional signage that indicates it's a van accessible space. So this picture is actually not quite what we're looking for in our survey. What we're actually looking for is two things. One is, and this is all in your survey, so you don't have to memorize this or take notes. One is the international sign of disability, so that's the guy that looks like he's in a wheelchair. And then above that, or below it, we need to see the words van accessible. And that's the thing that the city really doesn't have much. And so what they're going to be doing is putting temporary and ultimately permanent signs on all of their accessible parking signs that have this additional van accessible sign. So that we're going to be looking for that. We're hoping that some of these will be in place when you're surveying in November. Okay, we've covered these three terms. Another term you're going to see is what's called curb ramp. Some people refer to it as curb cut. And basically that's the cut in the sidewalk from the street that allows the person in a wheelchair to get up onto the sidewalk. All right, and we'll talk about how you need to measure those and how they need to be, the slope and everything like that. Speaking of slope, that's another thing you're going to be measuring with your tool. And so just to understand the terminology, what we're going to be doing is it's in ratio as the proportion of vertical rise to horizontal length. And we're going to be measuring in percentage, and we'll show you how to measure that in a second. But when we're measuring it, there's two different kinds of slope. One is the running slope. So the running slope is in the direction that you're going. So straight ahead, running up the ramp, and I'll show you a picture in a second. And then the other is what's called the cross slope, and that's perpendicular to the direction the person is going. So the running slope, we want to make sure it's not too steep, because if it's too steep, it'd be hard for a person to get up, or it might be too steep when they're going down, they could potentially fall. We also are concerned about the cross slope, because if that's not even if it's not that steep, if it's not even, a person could tip over from side to side. So that's why both of those are important. And you'll see in these pictures, up and down the ramp, that's the direction of travel, that's the running slope. And then cross slope, perpendicular to the direction that the person is traveling, that's the cross slope. And you can see it also in this other picture here. All right, I've mentioned this term already, alternative accessible entrance. So remember, if the main entrance is not accessible, like this building here, you can see it looks like an old school or maybe a church, and there are lots of stairs. That's going to be hard to make accessible. So instead what they've done is there's a side door here where a person can go in who's using a wheelchair. And there's even signage that shows them the way to go. So when you're going to a place to survey, we don't want you spending a lot of time, we don't want you to spend any time measuring the main entrance if that's not the one they've designated as the accessible entrance, all right? They've already said it's not accessible, so we don't need you to measure. We only want you to measure either the main entrance, if they're using that for all people, including people with disabilities, or if they do have an alternate entrance, that's the one we want you to measure. We'll talk about how to measure that in a second, too. All right, now it's time to understand how to work this digital level. So if everybody could pull that out and place it in front of you and get next to a partner if you don't have one yourself. And once you've opened it up and placed it level right in front of you so that the buttons are facing you, and then just press the on-off button, and it'll take a second, and you'll see a number, and there's also a button that says sound. If yours is making a sound, just press that, and that'll turn it off. There you go. Okay, so everybody's, if it's sitting level right in front of you, it shouldn't be that high a number. It should be like around 0.5 or less. Is that pretty much the case for everybody? Okay, good. Sometimes we have levels that are a little bit off. We need to replace them. All right, so that's the on-off button. You'll see up on the right sort of catty corner, diagonally up from the number, some sort of symbol. It could be a percentage sign. It could be a degree sign. It could be inch to foot, that kind of thing. If you press the button that says mode, which is right under the on-off button, you'll see how that symbol changes, right? So keep pressing until you get to the percentage sign. Okay, is everybody there? So this is, again, we're measuring in percentage. So this is where you want to end up. And usually once it's on percentage, if you turn it off and turn it back on, it should default to percentage. But you always want to double check and make sure that if it hasn't defaulted to percentage, press that mode button until you get to percentage. All right. The other button that's important here, besides the sound button, which we've already figured out, is the hold button. Okay, so you see that's 2 over from the mode button. The good thing about the hold button is if you're measuring, say, on the ground, and you have a hard time getting down to see the picture or see the measurement, you can just press hold and then pick it up, and then you notice the number doesn't change even though you're moving it around. It holds it even though it's not level. All right, so that's a good way to measure it. And then obviously to unlock the hold, just press hold again and it'll work. Okay? There are instructions on how to use this. If for some reason things go awry while you're out there, you can also call us if there's any problem. But hopefully this should be pretty easy to work. I do recommend that you turn it off because we've charged it fully with batteries, but we don't want it to run out of batteries while you're out there that day. So if everybody could turn off your level. Any questions? Yeah?
So for the running slope and the cross slope, would it just be like this way versus this way?
That's exactly right. So if you see here, this looks kind of like a ramp here. I would just, if I'm doing the running slope, I would just place it right there in the direction of travel. And that's what I'd be doing. And then for the cross slope, I'd do it this way. Okay? Yeah?
You ever get a fair bit of uneven slopes if you see kind of you go at the steepest part or something, if it's maybe kind of graded?
Right. And I forgot to say, because we're taping, I'm going to have to repeat the question. So the question is, what happens if you maybe have a slope where there seems like it's a little inconsistent? It's not going to be the same slope the whole way. And when we measure slopes, I'll explain that. But the general rule is we measure at the bottom, along the middle, and then the top. And then if you see a place that looks problematic, you can always measure additional. Yeah. Any other questions about that? Okay. So next we have our door pressure gauge. You take that out. It looks like this. And hold it this way so that the little part is at the top. Okay, so this is to measure the force of the doors, right? And so what you want to do here is there's a little black ring. You see that there? You want to push that all the way to the bottom. All right, because that's 0. And if you turn it sideways and look at it and roll it to you, you'll see that it's measured in pounds or kilograms. We're going with pounds, all right? And so that's the way you're going to measure. And what you're going to be doing is we're only measuring interior doors. Exterior doors are not covered by the ADA, so these are interior doors. And when you go to measure a door, what you're going to do is you're going to be going to the door, and then at the level of where the door handle is, go about halfway through the door. It's usually about 30 inches. And then you're just going to press the door until it starts to move. Once it starts to move, you stop, and that's where you record your measurement. Some people feel like they need to keep pushing all the way until the door is completely open. That's not going to be the measurement we want. We want the measurement as soon as the door starts to move. Now, sometimes you have doors like here. We have with the levers, and you need to maybe do the lever just to unlatch the door so that then you press it. Other times you just have doors that aren't latched, and you just press it as it is. Okay? And again, your survey will tell you exactly how to measure it, but it's 30 inches, and then you just push, and then do the measurement, and then make sure you go back to 0 before your next measurement. Any questions about the door pressure gauge? Okay, we're now to the actual survey. And as I said before, Section A is not going to apply to a lot of your surveys because if you don't have a parking lot or parking garage, remember no on-street parking isn't relevant, you'll answer that no at the beginning and you won't see any of these questions. But we want to go through all the questions because there are some places in the city that do have parking areas that you'll need to measure. So the first thing you're going to be asked on the survey is there, and if people will pull out the paper survey, feel free to follow along. That you don't have to. All the questions are in the PowerPoint. It just depends on how you best learn. But is there at least one designated van accessible space with signage? And remember what we said the sign has to have, the international symbol of disability and accessibility, and also is designated van accessible. So you're going to answer that. Again, if it's no, if you don't have that signage, you press no, you'd be prompted for a picture, and then they would then automatically show you some temporary and permanent remedies, and we'll show you what those are in a second. The next thing we're going to do is measure and make sure that the van accessible space is the right measurement. And there's two ways to comply with this. One is if the access aisle, that striped area in the middle, and the space itself are each 96 inches wide. All right, that gets us to 192. You can also comply if the space is 132 inches wide and the access aisle is 60 inches wide. So there's two different standards of ways to meet an accessible parking space. They both add up to 192. And if they don't have those measurements, you'd answer no, you take a picture, and then you talk about the temporary and the permanent remedy. All right. So again, as we talked about before, we need to make sure that the van accessible space is, if it's in a parking garage, is high enough for a van to get through. And what we want you to do here, obviously if you have a parking lot with no structure on top of it, you would just pick non-applicable and you'd be done. But if you do have a structure above it, then you need to, you should do is go to where the entrance to the parking garage is, and then take your tape measure, use that lock feature, and measure up and make sure that it's at least 98 inches tall, 98 inches high from the ground above you. And then if it is, then all you do is walk the path that somebody would travel or drive to get to that accessible space. And then I use sort of just a looking and seeing, is it dropping at all as I'm going along? And if it seems to drop, then you measure as you go along the way. All the way until you get to the parking spot itself. Definitely measure the parking space to make sure it's high enough. And then if you do have some sort of barrier there, if it's too low, we want you to put where it's the lowest and take a picture of where it's the lowest. And you can put in the comment section, you know, it's low throughout or only in one space, just to give us a little bit more information. So more comments the better, because that helps us, because we're reviewing these on paper, and you can kind of help us understand what it really is happening by describing some things in the comments section. All right. We also need to make sure that the designated parking space and the access aisles are level. And so this is where you'll take your level, you mark it, again, put it down, you can press hold if you want, and then pick it up. It needs to be 2.1% or less, basically making sure it's generally flat in the access aisle and the space itself. Okay, we also have sort of a common sense question. Is the designated parking space generally stable, firm, and slip resistant? What we're looking for here is we don't want a lot of gravel. If it snows that day, if they haven't cleared the snow, or if there's ice, that kind of thing, anything that would be problematic for somebody where they could potentially fall. We also want to make sure that the van accessible parking space is the closest space to the accessible entrance of the voting area, right? So when we're talking about accessible parking, it's not just about parking that's big enough, but we also want it to be the closest space, because a lot of people with disabilities need it because they can't walk far. And so we want to make sure that the space that they're giving us is the one that's the closest to not just the front entrance, but if they have an alternate entrance, we want to make sure that's the closest one, because it may be that it's closest to the front door, but it's really far from the accessible entrance. A lot of times with schools, the front door is on one thing, and then a whole block around is the accessible space. So we want to make sure the one they're saying is the van accessible space is the one that's closest to where voters with disabilities are going to go in. And here you can probably see it better on the PowerPoint, but these are just a couple of screenshots of the survey itself, just to give you a sense of what you're going to be filling in. So you'll see the first one they're asking about, does it have the right signage? The person said yes. That's all they have to do. But then the next question, it says, is the space wide enough? They put in numbers that aren't wide enough, and they answer no. And then that prompts these temporary and permanent remedies you'll see. So this person said, okay, temporary remedy would be you put traffic cones to outline the space better, and then a permanent remedy would be to repaint the accessible parking space so that it's wide enough. Okay, so that gives you an example of what's going to happen when you say no. Any questions about parking? Yeah.
Are we supposed to actually implement the remedies or just mark them?
That's a great question. So the question is, are we supposed to implement the remedies or just mark them? Generally, you're just going to be marking them. Okay? There are some times, like in the voting area, where if they could maybe rearrange a few things, it would help, or maybe they didn't put out the signage correctly. Things that the election judge could fix quickly. But as far as, they're not going to have cones on hands or anything like that. So really, you're just making a note of it. But if there is a way to fix something very easily, you're certainly free to do that. The main thing to know is that you're not an enforcer. So if for some reason the person is being resistant to your suggestion, just make a note of that. You can call us and we'll take care of it. We don't want you having any kind of sort of confrontations with an election judge. Any other questions about parking?
Yeah, I thought with the van accessible sign, you said that some of them might have a temporary thing up. Do we still mark that as non-compliant?
No, so the question was, what about if they have a temporary sign? Any temporary remedy is okay. The agreement we have between DOJ and the Board of Elections actually says any temporary or permanent remedies, as long as they're in place on election day. So that's fine. Now, they may make it permanent later, but they can make it temporary. If they do it every election day, they're still in compliance with the agreement. Any other questions? Okay, so we're now to section B. This is the other one that may or may not come up on your survey depending on how the voting area is set up. So this is what's called a designated drop-off area, and it'll have these features where there's a cutout in front of the building, there's usually an access aisle, and some sort of curb ramp for somebody to get out. So this is not something where people could be dropped off. You know, there's just a space in the curb. It's really a designed area for drop-off. It's an intentional area. It's not a loading zone for other purposes, that kind of thing. Now, one thing to know is that unlike the van accessible space, you don't have to have signage saying this is a designated drop-off area. That's not required. So you're not going to see those signs at all. But it does have to be something that's intentional as opposed to, yeah, I guess a person could be dropped off here. So typically what we're going to see are these circular driveways. I don't know if people can see in this picture. This is Peyton High School. They have the circular area, and it's cut out so that people can be dropped off out there. And then other times it'll be maybe a private property area where it's along here. Where you're going to see the most passenger drop-off areas are senior buildings, which makes sense, and they're usually these little half-circle driveways where people pull up and let people out. Okay, so what we're going to be measuring here, some of these are similar to what we just talked about. We want to make sure that the space where people are being let out is generally flat, so 2.1% or less. Again, just put it down on the ground, press hold, take a look, and mark what it is. We also want to make sure there's a marked access aisle. So that space I was just showing you of Peyton High School, it's all set forth, but they didn't put an access aisle. So they're going to be adding that to make it clear. We also want to make sure that the access aisle itself is generally flat, again, 2.1% or less. Again, some of these passenger drop-off areas are going to have some sort of covering. Again, these senior centers, a lot of times they'll be covered. Other times they're going to be open, like Peyton is. So if there's no building or structure above the passenger drop-off area, you just pick non-applicable. But if there is a drop-off area, you need to make sure there's at least vertical clearance of 114 inches or more. All right, it's a little different standard from the parking lot. And again, I would start from where the car pulls in, use your tape measure, use your lock above, make sure it's 114 or more, and then walk along to where the passenger drop-off area is. Just make sure it's still the same, and then as they're leaving, just kind of eyeball it and make sure that it hasn't dropped for some reason. All right? We also want to make sure that there's a curb ramp that separates the access aisle from the accessible route to the entrance. And then you're going to measure the curb ramp. And I'll go back to the picture from the very first one. So if you look at this picture, you can look on your slides here. After the access aisle, you'll see the curb cut or the curb ramp. What we want to measure is the middle part, this rectangular area. These side triangles are called side flares, and they're cut in because they're cutting into the sidewalk. We don't measure those. So you want to make sure these are at least 36 inches wide, just the ramp itself, not including the side flares. And then we want to make sure there's an accessible route connected to the access aisle, so you're not just dropping somebody off where they can't get into the building. And then we've got a couple screenshots again that show when you answer no, you get some temporary remedies and some permanent remedies to select those. Any questions about passenger drop-off areas? Again, if you don't have one, you answer no on those very first set of questions. You won't see any of those questions. They'll only come up automatically if you say yes. All right, so we're now to section C of the survey. This one applies to everything, every polling place. Obviously, there needs to be an accessible route to the front door. And you'll see in this picture, there's a couple different ways that people can get there. So this appears to be a passenger drop-off area where somebody's going in to the front door. Here's a transportation stop, and here's parking lot right here, and then there's general sidewalks here. So if you answer yes that there's parking, you'll have questions about the accessibility from the parking lot or garage to the front door. And if you answer yes to passenger drop-off area, transportation, or sidewalks generally, you'll have another set of questions. So there's basically two sets of questions you'll answer depending on if there's parking or not. Okay, so when we're measuring a route, generally it needs to be at least 36 inches wide. The sidewalk needs to be 36 inches wide. So again, think about yourself as a voter with a disability. Start maybe at the corner, and then check and make sure it's wide enough, the sidewalk's wide enough there. And if it's at least 36 inches wide, then just walk along all the way in the route. If it looks like it's narrowing, measure as you go along and make sure it doesn't narrow too much. Now there is an exception we've added this year, and that is DOJ says it's okay if it narrows from between 32 and 35 inches, as long as it's not narrowed for more than 2 feet or 24 inches. So this is the scenario here is maybe there's a tree and they've moved the sidewalk sort of around it and narrowed it a little bit. DOJ said we will allow that exception if it narrows not less than 32 inches and not more than 2 feet. And they can do this multiple times along the path, but they can't do it more than 2 feet at a time. People see that difference? Okay, we want to make sure there's not any kind of abrupt change in level, like a really high change in the sidewalk, the level of 0.5 or more. It needs to be less than that if there is any kind of change. Are there stairs along the path? And if so, is there a ramp? And that'll trigger your ramp questions. And then we want to make sure that the route is free of any kind of holes or anything where a wheelchair wheel or a cane, if somebody's blind, would get stuck. And here the standard is holes can't be bigger than 0.5 inches. All right? Now you may have sidewalks where there's multiple holes all the way around. What we want you to do is find the biggest hole, the worst offender, and that's where you take your picture and that's the measurement you would use. But if you find a sidewalk that's really torn up, in the comments section I would say there are lots and lots of holes in the sidewalk as opposed to there's just this one that can be patched up. Now, if you're starting at the corner, usually that's going to be a curb cut. If you're starting on the block, say of a school or a library, so you want to make sure that the curb cut itself is, as we did before, 36 inches wide, and then you're going to measure the running slope here, and it needs to be 8.3% or less. Again, the running slope in the direction of travel. Okay, we don't have a standard for the cross slope for this one. We will later. And then we also have that sort of common sense question. Are the walking surfaces stable, firm, and slip resistant? Again, we're looking for gravel and ice, snow, that kind of thing. Now there's this other concept called protruding objects, and this is a little bit tricky and it comes up in other parts of the survey, so hang with me for a second. This is really, we've been talking a lot mainly about accessibility for people in wheelchairs. This is to get to accessibility for people who are blind. All right, and so if you're blind and you have a cane, generally you're going to be able to detect any kind of protruding objects that are coming from the wall with your cane up to about 3 feet or 27 inches. You know, you don't see people with their cane out in front of them, right? And so the protruding objects we're concerned about are those that are above that general area where a cane would be, 27 inches, and the height of a normal or typical person. So typically people aren't taller than 80 inches. And so the standard is you can't have protruding objects between the 27 inches below and the 80 inches above. All right? And that's what we're concerned about. Now there's a picture here that I don't think is very easy to see. I don't know if you can tell it in the handout you have. This is also in your DOJ checklist document on page 8. But what you'll see here in this area right here is it appears that there's some objects that are mounted to the wall and are protruding out. Those are protruding objects that are wall mounted. And the standard here is you can't have a protruding object that's more than 4 inches between that 27 and 80 inch standard. Okay, so not more than 4 inches if the protruding object is mounted to the wall. There are other protruding objects. Again, you may not be able to see, but there's right here, there's a sign, it looks like, that's on a post. Okay? For anything that's on a post, it can't be more than 12 inches protruding in. Now the reason why it's a different standard is because the cane is going to detect the post up to a point, but if the sign is really extending into the path of travel, the cane's not going to help if it's all the way 12 inches in. Okay, so wall mounted, not more than 4, post mounted, not more than 12. We also, and again outside you're not going to see this, you're going to see it more inside, but sometimes there'll be objects from above, and they have to be 80 inches or higher to be compliant with the ADA. So you're going to be asked about, is there a wall mounted? And we've asked this in sort of an odd way. It says, is the route free of these objects? We ask that so you can get to yes if there's no objects. And if you say no, it's not free, that gets you to have to do the remedy and take a picture. Okay? And then it asks about the post mounted, not more than 12 inches. And then from above, it can extend more than 80 inches into the path of travel. Any questions on protruding objects? And Michelle?
For the post-mounted sign, is it from the post itself, 12 12 inches in one direction.
Yes. So the question is, when you're measuring the post, how do you measure it? It's from the post itself into the path of travel. Yeah, thanks. Good question. All right, so we're also measuring as we're walking up to the front door, is the slope generally level? And here the standard is 5% or less. So again, I would measure at the beginning, walk along. If it feels like it's going up or down at a grade that you're sort of seeing different, measure it along the way, and again, put the measurement, the highest measurement, into your survey. We also here want to look at the cross slope. So again, at the beginning, check perpendicular, is it 2.1% or less, and then periodically check as you're going to the front door. And here's just some screenshots showing you some examples of that. All right, any questions about the approach to the front door or how to measure any of those things? Okay, we're now to section D, which is the front door itself. And again, remember, if it has a designated accessible alternate entrance, that's the one you're going to measure front door here. You're not going to measure the front door there with all the stairs. But if the main entrance is the one for voters with disabilities, you'll measure that one. Okay. So here, again, you're going to see the same standard. We want to make sure that the area around the door is generally level, 2.1%. Just put it down, move it around a little bit, make sure it's 2.1% in all directions. And then we want to make sure the door is wide enough. And here the standard is it needs to be 32 inches wide. Now, it's important when you're doing this measurement that you actually open the door, okay? Because think about it, if you're doing this, when you open the door, there's less space, right? So you want to open it up perpendicular and measure from where the door's open to the other side of the door and make sure that's at least 32 inches. We also want to make sure that the hardware is accessible, okay? There are some people with disabilities who have dexterity issues and don't have fine motor skills, maybe if they have cerebral palsy. We want to make sure that they can independently open the door as well. So you measure this with like you have a closed fist and not use any sort of fine motor skills. What we're looking for here are doorknobs or the thumb latch that you sometimes see on old doors. Most doors you'll see have these levers like we have here at Jones Day, or have the push bars where you just push in. You can do that with a closed fist. So these 4 pictures are ones that people can do without having fine motor skills. So these are the ones we're looking for, hopefully in most places. But if you see some that require the fine motor skills, the thumb latch or the doorknob, we want to mark those there. We also want to make sure that the threshold isn't too high. The standard here is it can't be higher than 0.5. You'll notice I'm saying 0.5 and not ½ inch. The reason is the survey takes decimals. It doesn't take fractions. So that you'll see that, and if you put a fraction in, it's not going to recognize that. So keep it in decimals, both for your percentages as well as for your measurements. So 0.5. If the lip of the threshold is between 0.25 and 0.5, it needs to be beveled. So it needs to be curved over. It can't be just flat or just straight up. Okay, so we also need to make sure if we're in a wheelchair that we are able to maneuver. And a lot of times when you open doors, if there's not enough space beside the door, you can't maneuver. So there needs to be at least 18 inches of clearance provided to the side of the latch. So if this is the door where the latch is, there needs to be an additional at least 18 inches. So when the person opens the door, there's room for them to maneuver around. We have a picture here. So you can see as the person is pulling out, there needs to be at least 18 inches this way so that they could go through the door. If this was a wall right here, they wouldn't be able to get in because they're opening the door and trying to get in at the same time, right? So it needs to be at least 18 inches to the side of the latch there. Now sometimes, like here at Jones Day, you've got a long way from where you open the door to the wall. So you're not going to have to measure the whole wall in those situations. What you would do in that case is just put 18 inches because that's compliant, all right? We also sometimes, yeah, you had a question.
I have compared to like these doors here, if there's a large garbage can next to it, is that an issue? Those wouldn't block, but like I'm picturing like a big 2x2 wall.
Right, yeah, anything that would be a barrier. It doesn't have to be a permanent barrier. It could be something you can remove. So what you'd put is remove the garbage can. That'd be one of those great places for the other that we wouldn't have because you can remove the barrier there. Good question, yeah. Okay, sometimes when you go into a building, there's not just one door, but there's a second door, a door in a series, and we want to make sure there's room between the doors for somebody to maneuver. So what you do here is you open the first door if it opens in, and then measure from where it opens in to the next door. And that standard is 48 inches. So open it up perpendicular, and then from the edge of the door, measure all the way up to the next door and make sure it's at least 48 inches. Now that we're on the interior door, and again, not all places have a second door, but if you do have the interior door, that's where you're going to measure the weight and make sure it's not too heavy. So again, we're not measuring exterior doors, but we are measuring interior doors. Go to where the latch is, over 30 inches, about halfway in the door. Make sure it's not latched, and then push, and as soon as it moves, look at where the black ring is in pounds and record it there. All right? Again, the standard here is not more than 5 pounds. Sometimes what we'll see on election day is these interior doors are propped open. We're not ever sure if they're always propped open or if maybe they're propped open that day because the weather's nice or something like that. So what we want you to do is to unprop the door, close the door, and then measure the force of the door, and then put it back where you found it. Okay, so unprop it, measure it, and then put it back. Sometimes you're going to have on these interior doors automatic doors. Now these aren't required by the ADA, but if they are there, we don't want you to measure the force of the door because those are usually very heavy, but what we want to make sure is that they're actually working. So all we want you to do is just to test and make sure it's opening from the front as you enter the building as well as when you are exiting. So measure on both sides, or test it on both sides by pressing the International Symbol of Disability button that are there. You don't measure the force for those. You just click NA, and then in the comment section it would say automatic door is working or is not working. If there is that second door, you have to do all the things that we talked about for the front door, so besides the force. So you want to make sure it has hardware that's usable with a closed fist. You also want to make sure there's that 18 inches of clearance that we talked about, and we want to make sure it's generally level, 2.1% or less. Again, we look at the interior door threshold. Sometimes they're completely flat, but if there is a threshold, it can't be more than 0.5 inches, and if it's between 2.5 and 0.5, it needs to be beveled over. And then we want you to make sure that if they have an alternate entrance, is there signage that correctly points you to that alternate entrance? It can be permanent signage or it can be temporary signage. What we oftentimes see is they don't put up signage at all. So this is, going to your question before, this is one where you could, when you get into the voting area, you could say, did you get any signage for the alternate entrance? And they're like, oh yeah, I didn't know I had to put it up. And then you could ask them to put it up. They're usually very happy to do it. Sometimes we also see they put it up wrong, so the arrow will be pointing the opposite direction to where it actually goes. So that's another one to encourage them to, put in the right sign and have it facing the right way. And typically people are very willing to do that. We also want to make sure if they do have an accessible alternate entrance that it's unlocked. Oftentimes, especially at schools, the main entrance is open, but the alternate entrance is locked. And of course, as we know, security purposes, that's not surprising. But on election day, a voter with a disability should be able to vote just like anybody else. Shouldn't have to wait for a janitor, shouldn't have to, stand out there and ask somebody to help them out. They should be able to enter any time. And if they need to have a guard there for security purposes, that's up to them, but it needs to be unlocked. And if it's not, you'll note that in your survey. And this is just another screenshot of the accessible entrance, just to give you a sense of some of the remedies that come up. Okay, so now we're up to section E, all right? And this is the route from the entrance into the voting area. So some places that you get to, you're going to open the front door and you're going to go right into the voting area. And if that's the case, you'll answer, is there a route from the entrance, or let's see the question, does the accessible entrance open directly into the voting area? If you say yes, you'll get no more section E questions because you're right in the voting area. What section E is measuring is the accessibility of like a hallway from the front door to the voting area. So if you say no, that it doesn't open right into it, then you'll get all the other E questions. If you say yes, this is the only E question you'll get, and you move right on to section F. And then these questions, I'm not going to go into all the details, but these questions within the voting, within the building on the way to the voting area are the same questions we saw before. So the width of the hallway, is it 36 inches wide? Are there level changes? Is there a slope there that's more than 5%? Are there protruding objects from the side? Remember, 4 inches from wall mounted, 12 inches from post mounted, 80 inches from above. And then are there any doors along the way? If yes, you just answer those questions. Are the doors wide enough? Is there a threshold on the doors? Is there clearance? All those questions we answered before are the exact same questions that will come up here. Again, sometimes you won't have any doors in the hallway. You just put non-applicable. But if it does apply, just answer them the same way we did before. Any questions about getting to the polling place itself? Okay. We're now to the voting area. You thought we'd never get there, right? We're now here. Section F. We're in the voting area. And basically what we're looking to do is, first of all, we want to make sure that it's generally this common sense question we have, that it's stable, firm, slip resistant. There is an exception for gyms. So if you're in a gym, it's going to say, is your voting area a gym? All you have to do is say yes or no. We're not going to ask you about any details about the gym. We'll take it from there. But there is an exception for a gym when it comes to some of these slip resistant issues. Within the voting area, we also want to know about those mounted protruding objects, right? And remember here, what we're talking about is the voter's experience. So if the election judge is at a table and behind him is something protruding and the voter doesn't go back there, we don't worry about that. That's not a barrier to a voter. So it's really any protruding object that isn't in the path of a typical voter, not everywhere in the whole gym, so to speak, only where the voter is going to be going. And remember, those protruding objects are between 27 inches and 80 inches. Okay. One other thing that's a little different in the voting area is that there's 2 different kind of voting booths we want you to look for. One is an accessible voting booth, and that's what the picture is here. And that is a voting booth that's just like any other voting booth. The only difference is that it's lower. So most voting booths are kind of like this podium. You walk up and you fill in your ballot. You have privacy and you're done. This is for somebody in a wheelchair where they could just roll up to a voting booth that is an appropriate level for them because they're not going to be able to access the standing one. And so the standard here is it needs to be the surface itself where they're voting needs to be between 28 inches and 34 inches high. All right, there's a variance there. If you're within that variance, you're compliant. Then you need to make sure that the knee space is at least 27 inches high, so where your knee would be, not the surface. So the surface is here, the knee space is below, and then it needs to be at least 30 inches wide. All right, so 30 inches wide, 27 inches high for your knee, and then 28 to 34 for the actual space for your vote. Now for here, we often see polling places where there's not one set up. And a lot of times we'll ask election judges, where's your accessible voting booth? They'll say, you know what, we don't have anybody in wheelchairs in our neighborhood, so we didn't set it up. Well, the reason you haven't seen anybody in wheelchairs is because you haven't made it accessible probably. Or how do you know if you have anybody in your neighborhood? And somebody could have moved in since the last election. So that question is obviously, that answer is not the kind of thing that we want to hear. So that's one where you would encourage them to set this up. They may tell you they don't have one, tell them to look. Then they'll say, oh yeah, that's what that is. Okay, and then they'll set it up. So ideally what you'd like to do is have them set it up and then you can measure it once it's set up. And if they set it up and the measurement's correct, it's compliant, but put in the notes, election judge failed to set it up, just so we know there's an issue maybe with that particular election judge or some kind of communication that they didn't understand. Okay. We also want to make sure that there's room behind where the person's voting, both the lowered booth as well as the electronic machine, that there's at least 60 inches from where they're voting out, 60-inch diameter. So you aren't going to have this little circle. Board of Elections is looking to maybe develop one of these that would fold up and then you just sort of throw it down, and it's really handy. They're not there yet, so you have to just use your tape measure and go 60 inches out from the voting booth where the toe and knee clearance is, and then go back from there, 60 inches. Okay. We also want to make sure that the accessible voting machine is also set up correctly and has enough space. So again, we have an accessible voting booth, which is just a regular booth, and then an accessible voting machine, which is still lower, but it has that accessible machine there. So you're going to do the same measurements as before. It needs to be between 28 and 34 inches high for the surface, and then 27 inches of knee space, and then 30 inches wide. So the same spacing, but then we also want to make sure that the machine is working. So I usually ask the election judge, how's the electronic machine working? Has anybody used it yet? It's going great. Make sure it's plugged in. Sometimes they either haven't set it up or they haven't plugged it in because nobody's asked to use it. Make sure it's there. And then you just fill in why it is that it wasn't set up. Was it not set up correctly? Not enough room? What was the reason here? Because what we want to make sure is that there's at least 36 inches in the whole path of travel for the voter. Just like the sidewalk is 30 inches, just like the hallway needs to be 36 inches, the path of travel for the voter needs to be 36 inches as well. And this is something that we see a lot of problems with, where they're putting two voting booths in a very small room, and then it's the folks in wheelchairs who go to have challenges because there's just not enough room for them to get through here. Now remember, you may be in a voting area that has more than one precinct. And if that's the case, it'll automatically give you questions for Section F for each precinct. All right? You're not going to have to answer all the questions that you did before for each precinct. All those questions apply because it's the same path of travel for the precinct if they're in the same room, right? But what happens is sometimes within that room, one is accessible and one's not. I went to a school and it was in an auditorium, and one of the precincts was on the main auditorium floor, and the other was up on the stage that you could only get to by stairs. So it was totally different answers for the two precincts, even though they were in the same room. They were set up, one was accessible and one wasn't. And so they changed it and moved one precinct out, and the other precinct will stay where it is. We also want to make sure that people with disabilities have the same privacy people without disabilities have. A lot of times what we'll see is that the accessible voting machine is put right by the registration. So as you're registering to vote and signing in, you can see what the person's voting, who they're voting for. Obviously, we want everybody to have the same privacy. So that's another one where you could say, could you please move this to give this voter privacy, and they can move it. If they won't move it, just make a note in your survey. Okay, so that's the survey. Generally, there's only 3 more things we need to go over that may or may not come up as you go along, and this is whether or not you check their ramps, lifts, or elevators on the way through. So here is a typical situation: a ramp at the front entrance that we're going to. We want to make sure that these are accessible. So the running slope of the ramp has to be 8.3% or less. Remember, that's the direction of, and as we talked about at the beginning, it's good to set your level at the base of the ramp. Make sure it's 8.3%, and then walk up the ramp, and if you see it's getting steeper or different, just put it down about halfway, and then at the top, make sure it's consistent, and then just put the highest percentage that you measure on the ramp as your answer. And then again, the cross slope, perpendicular to the path of travel, 2.1% or less. We also want to make sure that the ramp rise we don't want the ramp to be too long, and so for this, what we're looking at is basically the height of the ramp. So if you see here, the base of the ramp, you want to go to where is the highest level distance. So here the standard is 30 inches or less. So you go to the base of the ramp and then measure to the highest level of the ramp. And for this one, you would do it from here to here, okay? So you do it for each ramp as you're going up. We also want to make sure that the ramp is wide enough. And again, you want to measure, if there are handrails, you want to measure inside the handrails, and that has to be at least 36. Let me make sure I get the standard right here. Yeah, 36 inches wide between the handrails if there are handrails. We also want to make sure that there is a landing at the top and the bottom of each ramp. See, for safety purposes, you don't want it to be sort of nowhere for them to go. So the standard here is it needs to be at least 60 inches approaching the ramp and 60 inches coming off the ramp, measuring straight ahead. Now, if you have a ramp that is like this, perpendicular, where it goes to a right angle, or you have those alternating ramps where you're going up here and then you're going up there, you need to make sure you have 60 inches going up and the other way. So it needs to be 60 inches deep and 60 inches wide, so for maneuverability purposes. But that's only if there are alternating ramps. For regular ramps, it's just 60 inches approaching, 60 inches afterwards going forward. Alternating ramps, 60 inches going forward, and 60 inches wide for maneuverability. Yeah?
Yeah. You're talking about a rise for each ramp. You said would each of those straightaways be considered its own ramp? In other words, is that Would that second ramp, would that make a difference from the top of that to the height of the middle point?
Right, so the question is of the rise. Yeah, you want to measure it from the newest direction of the ramp. So for each direction of the ramp, you're looking at the rise. So you'd measure from here to here, and then from here to here. And this would be for this ramp, and that would be for this ramp.
On that last one there, from the bottom to the top, so you're not giving credit for the halfway point that.
Well,
in
I
other words-
think sometimes there's a little bit of an optical illusion here because
Okay.
once you're going up, it sometimes goes from here, and so this isn't really here for the base.
that's what I was
You know what I mean? You're going up and then you're here, and it would be just from that ramp. Yeah. So it's basically the bottom of that triangle, if that makes sense, and the bottom of the triangle here. Yeah. It's hard to see through this picture, but it's not from here all the way down to here. Yeah. So it's 30 inches for each direction, if that helps. Okay, we had a couple more ramp questions. Let me make sure I get those. Yeah. Okay, and if they do have handrails, you only have to have handrails if the rise is more than 6 inches. But if they do have handrails, the handrails have to be between 34 and 38 inches above the ramp. So it can be anywhere between 34 and 38 inches. We also want to make sure people aren't unsafe and could fall off on the side. So we want to make sure that there's if there's a vertical drop off. So if it's not against a wall or something like that, there needs to be an edge protector. Okay, so something that keeps if a wheelchair wheel went into it, it would keep it from falling off. There's no standard for like how high it needs to be or what it needs to look like, just that whether there's one or not. Okay, now we're on lifts. Lifts are pretty rare. You're not going to see many of these, but we do see them a few times in certain buildings. And when we're talking about lifts, we're talking about these lifts that rise up, not these stair lifts like this. You're not going to see those, and if you do, we're not worried about those. We're worried about these. So these are ones that usually what they are is they're next to a set of stairs and are getting somebody a short area as opposed to an elevator, getting them up past one small barrier. So the main thing we want to find out with the lift is it operational at the time of the survey? A lot of times these things are broken, and so what's the point of having them if they're not working? So check and try to work it yourself. You also want to make sure it's independently operable, just like the door we said shouldn't be locked. The lift shouldn't be locked. You should be able to go up there and just operate it yourself. Or if they have somebody there who's there. What we don't want is somebody having to call the janitor, get a key, figure out how we're going to get this person with a disability into the polling place. People not thinking ahead of time. We want to make sure that there's certainly clear floor space, so it needs to be 30 inches by 48 at least. We also want to make sure that the controls aren't too high. So if you're in a wheelchair, the standard here is 48 inches or lower. And then just like we had with doorknobs, we don't want these controls to be such that you couldn't operate with a closed fist. So anything that requires pinching or really fine motor skills, those are problematic, twisting, those kinds of things. And then we want to make sure that it's maneuverability. So a lot of times with these lifts, what happens is you go in one place, you'll go up, and then you'll go out the side. And so if that's the case, we want to make sure that the opening itself is at least 32 inches, and then the side exit is at least 42 inches wide. All right, the last section, elevators. Again, you're only going to measure those elevators that are part of the path of travel to the voting area. If it just happens to have an elevator in the building that doesn't go to where the voters go, we don't want you to measure it. The elevator door has to be at least 36 inches wide. We want to make sure there's space to maneuver in the elevator car. We don't have a standard here, and that's intentional. The reason is because the ADA has numerous different kinds of elevators, and rather than having you figure out what kind of elevator it is, just measure it and we'll take it from there. So you just measure the width and the depth of the elevator and put that down. We want to, again, just like with the lifts, we want to make sure that the buttons aren't too high inside or outside the elevator. Again, the standard is 48 inches or lower. And then we want to make sure that there are audible and visible signals in the hallway and inside the elevator to indicate the arrival and the direction of the elevator cars. Okay, so usually you'll have some kind of light that blinks and sound that it makes. It doesn't have to talk. It doesn't have to say going up or going down or say the number. It just has to have some sort of ringing so that people would be able to know if they're blind. And then some sort of visual sign for people who are deaf. Okay, so that's the survey in a nutshell. If you are going to be partnering with somebody, and you can figure that out today before you leave. Each partners only need have one set of tools. And we're fortunate that we have a lot of volunteers here this year, and so we're actually getting short on tools. So if you are partnering, if you could just leave one set of tools here, but each pair, if you are going to go in pairs, you need to have a set of tools. You're free to go on your own, that's fine too, but just let us know when you're marking your volunteer form. So you need to turn in your volunteer form, your waiver, and then the survey. Those are the three things you could leave for us. And then take the tools for if you are going with a partner. Remember that if you are going with a partner, you each need to submit your own credentials. And again, you make copies of the credentials and fill one out for each polling place. What's going to happen is prior to Election Day, we're going to send you 2 emails. One is going to be with a practice survey, and it's good to practice these surveys just so you're not looking at it for the first time when you're out. So just go in, make up some numbers. I'd say answer no a lot so that you can see what the different remedies are, and just get used to it. And I think it'll make your experience a more pleasant one. I also encourage you to fully charge your phone the night before, because you are going to be taking pictures and you don't want to be out someplace where you can't charge your phone and take your pictures. In addition to the email with the practice survey, you're going to get an email with a link to all the different polling places that you're going to be going to. And again, those links, you just click on that link and it'll open you up into the survey. You're also going to get an FAQ, frequently asked questions, that will hopefully answer questions that frequently come up when people are out. And you'll also have a phone number that you can call for assistance on Election Day. And that's going to be to our manager, BB Novich, and this is her email and her phone number that you can call on Election Day. Any final questions? Yeah.
You're going to use our addresses. I'm thinking if you're going to look at partner for the leverage.
Oh.
Are we trying to team up based on?
Yeah. So the question is, are you, with respect to people's addresses, are we using that as far as where we're going to assign you? I mean, ideally, it'd be nice to assign people close to their polling, their home address, but the reality is we have to cover the whole city, and there are a lot of places in the city that our volunteers don't live, and so some people are going to have to travel. That's one reason we ask people of a car. There is something on there that says if you have special circumstances, so if you do have concerns about certain parts of the city, you can let us know about that, and we'll keep that in mind as we're assigning people. But yeah, if you want to partner with somebody and you want to, if it's more convenient, if you're living close to each other or you can meet up, I mean, it's really kind of a logistical thing that you guys can work out yourselves. Okay. And if you don't have a partner but you want a partner, you can mention there, and then we can try to partner you up once we get the forms back. If people aren't sure who you would partner with, if you want to partner with somebody. And again, I don't know, Mark, if there's an expectation of half day, full day. It's up to. We're pleased to have a half day, so we're not pushing for a full day. But
It really depends on your schedule.
yeah, so you guys can decide that. You don't have to do a full day. It doesn't sound like so. Whatever you can give, we're very appreciative. Okay.
Yeah, and we will send out an email on behalf of you guys to let you know to let the people know in the office that to the extent you can, you are participating in this, and so it should help with workflow. And then obviously if there are issues leading up to the date.
And I did hear, somebody's indicated they had a conflict. And I understand that, this day isn't an ideal day for everybody. Just so you know, we are going to be doing this again for the mayoral election in February. And given how many candidates there are running for mayor, there'll probably be a runoff in April. So to the extent it doesn't work out for you this time around, hopefully you'll have a chance to do it with us next year for the other elections. Because we're going to do these surveys for every single election up until the presidential election in 2020. So any final questions people have? Great. Well, again, thank you very much for not only your attention today, but your helping us out. You just keep in mind of if you were a person with a disability and you couldn't vote, how frustrating that would be, and what a difference you're making by doing this. So thank you very much.